Hi, everybody, and welcome to the weekly SDSU Center for Autism Research Spotlight, where we're here to highlight some of the wonderful research that's being done by our center members. What we're doing here is we're just taking advantage of these stay-at-home orders that we're experiencing with this COVID-19 pandemic to showcase the work that our center members do within this San Diego autism community. My name's Janice Chan, the administrative coordinator at the center.
And my name is Vinton Omaleki. I'm the Community Engagement Director here at the Center. Today we are speaking with Dr. Alyson Abel, Assistant Professor in the School of Speech, Language, and Hearing Sciences, and the Joint Doctoral Program in Language and Communicative Disorders, and a core member of the Center for Clinical and Cognitive Neuroscience. Thank you so much, Dr. Abel, for taking the time to speak with us. We really appreciate it.
Happy to be here.
Dr. Abel, could you just start by sharing a little bit about your background and how you got into this line of work?
Sure. So my background, I'm a trained clinical speech language pathologist. And then from that went on and did my PhD in child language from an interdisciplinary perspective. So I've studied child language development and disorders from the clinical side, from linguistic psychology, and then did a postdoctoral fellowship in where I learned about how to use neurophysiological measures to look at language processing. And so I've kind of combined it all together here at SDSU so that I am combining both behavioral training in kids and adults with disorders with neurophysiological training with all the experts that I am surrounded by who have expertise in all these areas as well to study kids with a variety of developmental disorders, including autism and other disorders.
Great. So then with regards to your research, what types of research and what area of developmental disorders research do you do?
Right. So I my major interest is looking at kind of the neural underpinnings of kids who have developmental disorders that affect their language. And by language, I mean, I mostly focus on things like grammar and vocabulary learning and just language learning in general. So not really their speech sounds as much as their kind of understanding and use of words and sentences. Some of that population that I focus on is kids with what we will call specific language impairment, or some call developmental language disorder. And this is about 7% of kids are affected by this. I'm going to, for this purpose, I'll refer to it as developmental language disorder. 7 to 10% of kids are affected by developmental language disorder, and it is language disorder with nothing else that can be known to cause it. So these are not kids with intellectual disability. They have no hearing loss, no other diagnoses that can cause language, but they're slow to start talking. They have affected vocabulary, they have affected grammar, and this kind of causes long-term academic and social challenges. So that's one of my major populations that I study. And then I also study with colleagues in the center, children with autism, and specifically looking at the language performance of those children, with again a focus on what is going on to cause and to contribute to their language disorders from a clinical lens of how could we guide intervention, early identification and intervention with these kids.
Fascinating. So, I mean, I guess you kind of touched on this, but why is this research important, and kind of what excites you about this kind of particular research? Yeah.
So I think that the thing with both of these populations, developmental language disorder and autism, that gets to me the most is that they're hidden disorders. Mm-hmm. These are disorders where you're walking down the street, you see kids, you know, from a distance or even up close, you interact with them, and you often don't know that there's anything going on. It's not clear. It's not something that you kind of see right away or you can identify. But these are very significant challenges that the children face, that their families and caregivers face, that can affect their them in school and social interactions and beyond, and really for both disorders or with them throughout the lifespan. And so I think that getting kind of that's one of the major things that drew me to both of these populations, is that these are some of the children who often will fly under the radar, and that could go both our kids with DLD and with autism, is that they may not be identified for a while. They have a lot of compensatory strategies that they do really well in enough things that maybe they aren't, they just don't stand out. A lot of our kids with ASD are identified earlier, and that's one of the things I know that we're working on as a field and across fields, disciplines. But there are still a lot of kids with ASD and a lot of kids with DLD who end up going a really long time, possibly their lifetime, without identification and diagnosis. So it affects our ability to treat them. It affects our ability to kind of enable them to be as successful as they can be. So that's really what has motivated me to work with these kids. And then I find it to be really rewarding. Not always from the kids themselves, but usually from the parents, right? There's something, each parent, each family member, each caregiver brings a different question and a different goal to the table when we're interacting with their child and talking about the diagnosis and the goals and what their needs might be. But we hope that they all leave knowing more and feeling empowered to help themselves and to help their children.
Great. And so can you go into a little more detail about some of your specific projects?
So I have two major lines of research. One is using electrophysiology, or EEG, to look at how the brain processes information while kids are learning language. So what we do there is kids, and I usually, for some of my research, I mostly focus on older school age kids. This is an understudied group of kids in the developmental language disorder population. So I look at school age kids 8 and up, and how, when they're learning new vocabulary, how their brain is processing the new vocabulary, and what that can tell us about how they approach the task of learning vocabulary, and how we could develop interventions to help guide them through this process, which is usually very problematic for them and can have long-term academic consequences. And then the other research that I'm part of a team led by Drs. Annika Link, Axel Mueller, Ina Fishman, and Peter Torrey. We are part of a team who recently started a project looking at the auditory precursors to language in toddlers with and without autism. And so my role, and my lab's role in that project, is to do the language assessments with the toddlers. And two of the major things that I love about that project are, one, that I get to work with this phenomenal team of scholars and learn from them on all of their neuroscience expertise and auditory expertise for Dr. Torrey. And two is that my students in my lab, who are master's students in clinical speech language pathology, get hands-on experience testing toddlers with ASD, and that is, or who are at risk for or thought to possibly have ASD. And that is valuable experience that they get, and they get to learn from, and then they have been using moving forward, because these are populations they want to work with clinically. So they're gaining valuable experience there as well. And then also secondary, my own son was one of the first participants in this study. So we actually have scans of his brain, which he doesn't appreciate yet, but he will one day.
That's awesome. So for this particular study, or I mean, maybe just any of your studies that you want to elaborate a little bit about, what do they look like from a participant's perspective?
So for the my EEG research with kids with developmental language disorder, they come into the lab and do a series of behavioral assessments where we kind of look at what their language skills are in terms of vocabulary, grammar, and some of their other nonverbal cognitive skills like attention processing. So they do a number of tasks. It takes about 2 to 2.5 hours. They are older, eight and up, so they can usually do that pretty well. And then they come back another day, and while wearing the EEG cap, we ask them to listen to sentences and identify what a new word means. And the EEG cap looks kind of like, I always tell them it looks like Avatar, because they've got like all these sponges stuck to their scalp, and then there's this tail looking thing that goes off the end. And I've honestly, when we run adult college age participants, they get a little more creeped out by the cap than any, especially like little boy. They're usually really down for that cap.
That's so interesting.
Yeah, they think it looks silly, and they get pictures, and we give them a candy if their parents let them. So all the good things, and money. So no one says no to that.
Yeah, that always helps.
It does. And so they do that on 2 different days. And then for the autism study, for the auditory precursors study, our role for that is the language testing, like I mentioned. So where my master students who are in my lab, where they come into play is they come in on usually the first and maybe also the second day of testing, and they'll observe and they'll write down everything the kid says and try to get a feel for what each child's ability is to use and to understand language. And so we both look at when they're playing with their parents and interacting with the other testers, how the kids are interacting, what they can do in that kind of spontaneous back and forth situation. And we do some standardized testing also to see, okay, if we give them specific prompts, how do they behave to those prompts? And that can be a range of anything like point to a picture to follow this task. Or really a lot of it is very naturalistic, because for our young kids, because these are, I don't think I mentioned this, these are toddlers. These are kids, youngest is like 18 months. So for those kids, they're not really test takers.
Yeah.
So we really want to see what they can do when they're actually interacting with a person. So we give them those tests, and then we play with them, and we audio record everything that they say while we're playing with toys. And we have a subset of toys that we use. And then other research assistants in the lab go back and we take those recordings and we write down every single thing that the child said. And then we will analyze it for the grammar and also for the speech sounds that the children use. So we have, it always surprises people how much information you can get out of just playing with kids, yeah, as far as language and social interaction goes. I mean, it's really your biggest data mine, and is just sitting down and playing.
That's fascinating. So is it, what is it about the playing that you can observe? Is it like the nonverbal cues plus the verbal cues, or what?
Both. For our really little kids who are at risk for autism, we want both, because we know that at 18 to 24 months, they may not be speaking at all. And even for our kids who are not at risk for autism, they may not be speaking much at 18 to 24 months. That's within the normal range of development. So we want to see if they have those precursors to language that we would look for: joint attention, the ability to communicate non-verbally, all of those things, gestures. Those are some of the major indicators of language is about to kind of explode and about to come online. Mm-hmm. So we want to see if those are there and if those are developmentally appropriate. And then for that study, we'll test them again when they're 4. And so then we can say, well, if they looked like X at 18 months, what do they look like when they're 4? And so we can use it as a guide for predicting what they'll look like when they're 4, which is going to give us a lot of information to say, okay, can we predict from 18 months who needs a lot of services and maybe who needs less, right? Like if they're doing X, Y, and Z at 18 months, they're going to probably be better off at 4 years. But if they're not doing X, Y, and Z, if they're only doing X at 18 months, then they're going to be lower language-wise at 4. Then those may be kids who we need to spend more time with and give more attention to.
Have any of these studies come up with findings yet? I know some that were in process, but do you have any preliminary findings?
So for the auditory precursors study with the other faculty members in the Center for Autism Research, we just started testing participants, and we were really just getting in the throes of testing participants when we were shut down. So that's been frustrating, but no worries, we'll pick right back up and keep moving. But so that one is very early. And then for the other research looking at kids with developmental language disorder, we found some really interesting findings from our typically developing school age kids that whether you ask them to pay attention to what a word sounds like the word nibe, like kind of remember the form nibe, versus what a word means, like, oh, nibe means shoe, affects what they memorize. And it seems silly, but if you say like, okay, I want you to tell me what nibe means, and you ask them later what is nibe, they may not have ever paid attention to the sound structure. And so they're like, I don't know what nibe is, but I know there is some word that I was supposed to remember that means shoe. And so kind of looking at packaging the word as a whole unit and make sure we're training both the sound structure of the word and the meaning of the word at the same time is really necessary, rather than just focusing on one element of it. And so and we've seen with kids with developmental language disorder that they have a lot of trouble doing both of those things, that asking them to pay attention to all of that at once can overly tax their language system. And so it may be too much. So we need to figure out an intervention, how we guide them through learning both parts of what goes into a word.
So interesting.
Yeah, very cool.
So I think you mentioned a lot of different topics that you've done research in, this whole language acquisition piece, like grammar, how people form grammar and things like that. Even the importance of play in developing speech and language. If people are interested in learning about any of those topics or anything related to the work that you do, where can they go? What are some trusted resources you might recommend?
Great. So for people interested in finding out about developmental language disorder, this is again this is not a new disorder. It is a disorder that we've had a lot of trouble doing pushes for awareness for. But in the last 2 years, there have been a group that primarily based out of England that's been been doing a really good job of promoting knowledge of the disorder. Because like I said, it affects 7 to 10% of kids, which is about 2 kids in every classroom. So it's a huge prevalence. And the best website for that is from Rattled, Raising Awareness of Developmental Language Disorders, radld.org. And that group is doing a really good job to put out information for parents, information for kids. They have amazing sets of videos for parents to watch, for kids of any age who have been diagnosed with developmental language disorder to watch, that will give them guidance on social expectations, for educators, for speech language pathologists, and they have it translated, oh my gosh, I can't even imagine it. Last check, I want to say 7 to 10 languages that they've done these information videos in, and more are coming in regularly. I know I've seen Greek, Polish, all kinds of languages that people are translating this information. So that's one of the biggest ones for raising awareness for developmental language disorders. For parents who have concerns about their children's early language development in the first 3 years of life, the best thing I can say is to go to any early start information, go to the regional centers. What's commonly not well known is that the regional centers in San Diego do accept self-referrals. So if you have any concerns about your child's language development in the first few years, you can self-refer. You don't have to get a physician or a pediatrician to refer, or any other specialist. And I think that that's really important for families to know that they don't know. And that it's better to assess early and to try to get in front of it than it is to wait and see if they catch up. The wait and see attitude is one that in speech language pathology we've been trying to squash, because waiting, and I think that goes for autism as well, right?
Yeah.
Wait and see has never been, any clinician from any branch of clinical practice has been does not promote wait and see. It is better to test and to say, this looks pretty good. Let's see if we can jumpstart your child's system and see if we can catch them up. Or I'm seeing some red flags here. Let's try to move forward. So that is definitely, if you have any concerns, I would say to reach out to some professionals and try to get some assistance there.
Fantastic. Wonderful. Really good resources. We'll definitely, we will share those with any viewers. We'll post links to them underneath this video. So thank you so much, Dr. Abel, for sharing your expertise and information about your studies with our community. We really appreciate your time and the impact you're making in research in autism and other developmental disorders. So for you watching, if you want to learn more about what our center members are up to, you can find out more info at autism.sdsu.edu.
Or go to @SDSU Autism on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter. And we'll see you next week for our next Research Spotlight. Until then, we hope that you can stay safe, stay healthy, and stay connected.